Opera is not merely a musical genre. It is one of the ways Europe learned to think publicly about itself. When opera appears, it does so because speech alone has lost authority. Words can argue, but they no longer persuade reliably. Music, however, can bypass argument and reach belief directly. Opera therefore emerges where politics, religion, philosophy, and emotion collide, and it always attaches itself to cities, institutions, and power. To know opera is to know how history learned to sing. Chapter 1: Florence, Humanism, and the Invention of Opera. Opera emerges around 1600 in Florence as a deliberate experiment rather than a popular entertainment form. Renaissance humanists believed that ancient Greek tragedy had been sung, and that its moral power came from the fusion of speech and music. At the same time, the Catholic Counter-Reformation demanded art that was emotionally persuasive, intelligible, and immediate. These impulses converge in early opera, aesthetically, philosophically, and politically. In 1600, Eurydice by Jacopo Peri was performed at Palazzo Pitti for the wedding of Maria de' Medici and Henry IV of France. The choice of subject was symbolic. The myth of Orpheus celebrates the civilizing power of music itself. Importantly, the opera alters the classical ending. Orpheus succeeds, Eurydice is restored, and the work concludes happily. Myth reshaped to serve dynastic celebration and political optimism. Opera here functions as court spectacle and statecraft as much as philosophical inquiry. Claudio Monteverdi, considered by many as the father of opera, was likely present in Florence at this moment, though his attendance at the performance cannot be documented with certainty. What is certain is that only a few years later, with L'Orfeo, he transforms the genre. L'Orfeo retells the same myth, but refuses consolation. Orpheus looks back and loses Eurydice, not as moral punishment, but as psychological failure. Monteverdi invents a musical language in which harmony darkens with grief, rhythm falters with doubt, and melody stretches when words fail. Inner life becomes audible. Where Eurydice resolves myth into political affirmation, L'Orfeo turns inward. The catastrophe emerges from hesitation, memory, and desire. Opera becomes a study of consciousness under pressure. From its beginning, opera is therefore both canonical and historical, a humanist attempt to revive ancient tragedy, a counter-Reformation tool of emotional persuasion, and a courtly art form shaped by power, ceremony, and ideology. Psychology and politics enter opera together. Chapter 2: Venice. Opera becomes public. What began in Florence with the Florentine Camerata, a small circle of late 16th century humanists attempting to reconstruct ancient Greek sung drama, now leaves philosophy behind and enters the marketplace. Florence invents opera, but invention alone does not make a tradition. That transformation happens in Venice, La Serenissima, the most serene republic. 17th century Venice is not a monarchy but a republic, oligarchic, patrician, and institutional rather than personal in power. There is no king to flatter, no court ideology to sustain. Instead, Venice thrives on trade, spectacle, and carefully regulated pleasure. Carnival culture, masked anonymity, gambling, courtesans, and theatrical excess define Venetian public life. Opera enters this pleasure-seeking environment and adapts accordingly. In Florence, opera functions as dynastic display. In Venice, it becomes public enterprise. In 1637, with the opening of Teatro San Cassiano, Venice becomes the first city in history to sell opera tickets to the general public. Performances cluster around Carnival, when foreign visitors flood the city and entertainment becomes economic infrastructure. Opera ceases to be an exceptional court ritual and becomes a repeatable urban practice. This is a decisive shift. Opera must now succeed practically, not symbolically. It must attract crowds. It must hold attention. It must compete. Plots grow intricate. Emotional contrasts sharpen. Characters pursue desire, status, and survival rather than embody moral ideals. What later observers call Venetian decadence is better understood as commercial pragmatism. Venice also invents the impresario, the early producer who raises capital, assembles casts, manages singers, and treats opera explicitly as enterprise. Singers become central. Star performers draw audiences across seasons, and roles are shaped around specific voices. Castrati grow increasingly important. Boys surgically castrated before puberty so their voices would retain a high register while developing adult lung capacity. Their extraordinary projection and agility cut cleanly through large theatres. This practice does not arise from libertinism, but economics. In a crowded entertainment market, extreme vocal impact sells tickets. Female singers remain essential too. Virtuosity here is not symbolic, it is transactional. Opera reorganizes itself around recognizable musical events. Arias, self-contained solo pieces, are designed to stop the show. Emotional peaks are engineered for applause. These features become permanent parts of operatic grammar. At the center of this transition stands Claudio Monteverdi. Monteverdi had already established himself as a leading composer of madrigals before writing his first operas in Mantua. After a dispute with the Gonzaga court in 1612, he moves to Venice, becoming director of music at St. Mark's Basilica, where he remains until his death in 1643. His late Venetian masterpiece, L'Incoronazione di Poppea, The Coronation of Poppea, which succeeded The Return of Ulysses, marks a turning point. Instead of myth, it presents Roman history. Emperor Nero engineers the downfall of rivals so that his lover, Poppea, can become empress. Virtue is punished, ambition succeeds. The opera ends with a sensual love duet between the victorious couple. No gods intervene. No justice is restored. Opera confronts political reality. Much later, one building comes to symbolize this Venetian model. Teatro La Fenice, opened in 1792. La Fenice matters because it crystallizes the Venetian system in durable form. It represents opera as public rather than courtly theatre, commercial rather than ceremonial, repeatable rather than exceptional. Its repeated destruction and rebuilding, the reason it is called the Phoenix, becomes symbolic of something real. Opera as civic habit, not one-time golden age. La Fenice's importance does not end there. In the 19th century, it becomes a major site of the bel canto tradition, hosting works by Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, and Verdi. Bel canto, beautiful singing, is not mere prettiness. It is a complete aesthetic system, emphasizing purity of tone, seamless legato, agility under control, and expressive nuance without force. It treats the human voice itself as an ideal of balance and discipline. This matters culturally. In a politically fragmented peninsula, much of it under foreign rule, Italians could not yet claim political unity, but they could claim something else. No one sings like us. Bel canto becomes a source of shared identity, rooted not in borders or armies, but in sound. Opera houses like La Fenice become places where this vocal ideal is publicly tested, admired, and transmitted. Venetian opera never imposes a unified style or philosophy. What it does is more fundamental. It teaches opera how to survive without a king. Venice does not tell opera what to say, it teaches opera how to keep being heard. That is why La Fenice is remembered, and that is why Venetian opera matters. Chapter 3: France, Opera as the State Speaking. France takes a fundamentally different path from Italy or Venice. Where Venetian opera grows out of commercial urban life, French opera is centralized, regulated, and shaped from the beginning by state power. From the 17th century onward, opera in France is organized around what begins as the Académie Royale de Musique, later the Paris Opera, a monumental body designed not merely to entertain, but to represent the nation to itself. Opera here is not civic, it is institutional. Opera enters France not through public theatres, but through palace corridors. The system begins under Cardinal Mazarin, the Italian-born chief minister of France and political heir to Cardinal Richelieu, whose pupil and successor he was. Mazarin imports Italian opera directly into the French court, using spectacle as political technology. Like Jean-Baptiste Lully, Mazarin is an outsider. Two Italians arrive in Paris, one with politics, one with music, and together they teach France how to perform power. This unfolds alongside the rise of Louis XIV, who transforms monarchy into ritualized performance. He doesn't just patronize the arts, he dances in court ballets, famously appearing as Apollo, the sun god. Silk heels on marble floors, powdered wigs under candlelight. The king does not watch the spectacle, he steps into it. Versailles becomes a permanent stage set. Mirrors multiplying authority, corridors funneling ambition, music floating through rooms designed to awe. Lully rises with the Mazarin-built system and reshapes it into something distinctly French. Under him, opera becomes tragédie lyrique, elevated drama fused with chorus, ballet, and carefully regulated declamation. His defining masterpiece, Armide, tells of a sorceress who falls in love with the crusader she intends to destroy. Armide's tragedy is not that she loves, it is that she cannot master her passion. Emotion is powerful, but in French opera it must submit to proportion, clarity, and order. Desire enters in full costume, but it leaves in measured steps. There is no direct evidence that Lully personally saw L'Orfeo by Claudio Monteverdi, but he absorbs early Italian opera through Mazarin's productions and visiting companies. What emerges is French neoclassicism, art ruled by balance, rhetoric, and social harmony. This is the same cultural world as Corneille, Racine, and Molière, where passion is elevated, structured, and morally framed. In the next generation, Jean-Philippe Rameau expands the tradition with richer harmony and orchestral color. In Hippolyte et Aricie, forbidden love collides with divine authority. In Les Indes Galantes, Enlightenment curiosity appears through exoticized settings, sensual surface contained by classical architecture. By the 19th century, opera has grown from court ritual into something like historical cinema. Paris becomes the capital of French grand opera, defined above all by Giacomo Meyerbeer. In Les Huguenots, a Protestant nobleman and a Catholic woman fall in love as religious tensions rise around them. Their private romance is crushed by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. They die not because they fail each other, but because history overwhelms them. In Le Prophète, a humble innkeeper's son is swept into a radical movement and proclaimed a messianic leader. The plot is based on the life of John of Leyden, Anabaptist leader and self-proclaimed King of Munster in the 16th century. Manipulated by crowds and ideology, he becomes a symbol he barely controls. Revolution consumes its own figurehead. The stage fills with crowds the way city squares do. History itself becomes the leading character. Together these operas establish monumental political theatre. 5 acts, massed choruses, ballet, historical violence. Individuals no longer stand at the center. Societies do. Personal stories are absorbed into public catastrophe. Opera in France is so institutionalized that performers are effectively civil servants. Ballet remains essential because French opera grows directly out of royal dance culture. Only after this monumental tradition is firmly established do later figures such as Georges Bizet, Jacques Offenbach, and Léo Delibes appear, which we'll explore later. Seen whole, French opera forms a continuous line. From Mazarin's imported Italian spectacle, through Lully's absolutist order, through Rameau's Enlightenment color, to Meyerbeer's historical monumentality. It treats opera as national presentation. In France, opera wears uniform as well as perfume. This is why French opera sounds the way it does. It is the voice of the state, learning how to speak about passion, power, and history. Chapter 4. London, Handel and Moral Choice in a Marketplace. London takes yet another path. Unlike Versailles or Vienna, London is not a court-centered culture. It is a commercial metropolis. Power is negotiated through trade, parliament, and public opinion rather than embodied in a monarch. Art survives by attracting audiences, not pleasing kings. Opera in London therefore develops inside a marketplace. Italian opera arrives in early 18th century London as a fashionable import, supported by aristocratic patrons but sustained by ticket sales. Companies rise and collapse quickly. Star singers from rival factions. Newspapers review performances. Audiences divide themselves between vocal loyalties. Opera becomes a public sport, and at the center of this world stands Georg Friedrich Handel. Handel is not English by birth. He is German trained and Italian seasoned, but London becomes his permanent home. He works within the conventions of opera seria, heroic plots, virtuosic arias, and moral conflict. But he also manages companies, negotiates contracts, hires singers, and survives bankruptcies, a typical failed impresario. Handel is not merely a composer, he is an operatic entrepreneur. This matters because his music is shaped directly by economic reality. He must satisfy elite taste while filling seats. He must showcase imported Italian castrati, whose salaries often exceeded his own, while keeping drama intelligible to English audiences. London completes the transformation begun in Venice. The singer becomes an international celebrity, and opera organizes itself around recognizable emotional moments. Yet Handel does something distinctive with this system. Where many opera seria composers treat arias as decorative display, Handel turns them into acts of reflection. His masterpiece, Giulio Cesare, dramatizes Julius Caesar's campaign in Egypt and his encounter with Cleopatra. But this is not mere historical spectacle. Cleopatra is not a decorative lover. She is politically alert, strategically flexible, and emotionally intelligent. Caesar is not a distant conqueror. He reflects on leadership, mercy, and vulnerability. Cleopatra must defeat her brother to secure the throne. Caesar must decide whether conquest or alliance will preserve power. Romance unfolds in the shadow of violence. Handel's great innovation lies in how characters think in music. His arias are ethical soliloquies. Action pauses so that ambition, fear, tenderness, and doubt can be examined. Authority is never simple. Desire complicates power. This is opera as moral psychology. The same interior focus appears elsewhere. Rinaldo blends crusader fantasy with genuine emotional fragility. Alcina centers on a sorceress whose magical control collapses when she experiences real love. Again and again, Handel asks the same question. What happens to power when emotion intervenes? That question resonates deeply in a city governed not by absolutism, but by negotiation. London's operatic ecosystem is unstable by design. Subscription models fail, investors withdraw, new companies form. This volatility produces lasting features of operatic culture: fierce competition between stars, intense focus on individual arias, rapid stylistic adaptation to audience taste, and an expectation that opera must justify itself economically. London teaches opera how to survive in capitalism. It also produces its own critique. In The Beggar's Opera by John Gray, Italian opera is satirized mercilessly. Heroic figures are replaced by thieves and prostitutes. Noble posturing gives way to street realism. Its enormous success reveals something crucial. English audiences already sense that imported Italian grandeur can feel artificial. This is one of the earliest examples of modern cultural backlash. Eventually, the Italian opera market collapses altogether. Handel adapts once more, turning to English oratorio, a pivot driven not by aesthetics alone, but by audience economics. Taken together, London teaches opera a new kind of literacy. This is where opera becomes a marketplace rather than a court ritual, where success depends on audiences rather than monarchs, and where artistic survival requires adaptability. Handel embodies this world not just as a composer, but as an entrepreneur, running companies, negotiating contracts, enduring financial collapse, and reshaping his output in response to public taste. His Giulio Cesare shows what London makes possible. Arias become ethical soliloquies, characters pause to think, and power is examined from the inside. Around him, star singers generate rival factions, newspapers turn performances into public debate, and opera becomes a participatory urban spectacle. Even The Beggar's Opera belongs to this story, because it reveals how quickly London learns to satirize imported grandeur. If Venice teaches opera how to survive commercially, and Paris teaches it how to speak for the state, London teaches it something uniquely modern: how to dramatize individual conscience inside a competitive public culture. This is why Handel matters, and why London is where opera first learns how to think like a modern city. Chapter 5: Vienna: Opera as Enlightenment Social Theory. Vienna occupies a unique position in operatic history because it stands at the crossroads of imperial bureaucracy and Enlightenment reform. It is the capital of the Habsburg Empire, a centralized hierarchical state governing many peoples through law and administration. At the same time, Vienna absorbs Enlightenment ideas about reason, education, equality, and moral progress. Opera here develops under permanent tension between inherited aristocratic authority and emerging humanist philosophy. Unlike Venice, which treats opera as a commercial entertainment, or Paris, which treats it as state spectacle, Vienna becomes the place where opera begins to examine how society itself should function. The intellectual climate is reinforced by the policies of Joseph II, who actively promotes Enlightenment cultural reform, encouraging clearer dramatic forms, supporting German language opera, and limiting aristocratic excess. Reform is permitted, revolution is not. Vienna is a laboratory of controlled change. It is also important to see what Vienna is moving away from. The previous generation still works largely under aristocratic patronage. Joseph Haydn, for example, spends decades in exclusive service to the House of Esterhazy, composing symphonies and chamber music for a private court. Haydn represents the Enlightenment in its older form, ordered, rational, but still embedded in noble hierarchy. Mozart and Beethoven will push beyond this toward public culture. The first decisive operatic reformer in Vienna is Christoph Willibald Gluck. By the mid-18th century, Italian opera seria has become dominated by star singers and ornamental excess. Dramatic coherence often exists merely to support vocal display. Gluck explicitly rejects this model. In Orfeo ed Euridice, he removes excessive ornament, simplifies melodic writing, integrates chorus and orchestra into the drama, and insists that music must serve narrative meaning. His reform is conscious and theoretical. Opera should communicate emotional truth clearly, not impress through virtuosity. The myth of Orpheus remains, but Gluck transforms its function. Grief is direct, desire is restrained, expression is purified. This reflects Enlightenment values in musical form: clarity over excess, meaning over tradition, sincerity over convention. Gluck establishes a Viennese principle that will persist. Opera must justify itself morally. This foundation allows Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart to turn opera into social analysis. Mozart's central achievement changes perspectives. He gives every character full psychological reality, regardless of class. That revolutionary impulse immediately encounters political reality. When Mozart and his librettist Lorenzo da Ponte prepared Le Nozze di Figaro, or The Marriage of Figaro, they faced censorship. The opera is based on Beaumarchais' controversial play, which openly attacked aristocratic privilege by showing servants outwitting their noble master. Permission to stage it had to be granted by Joseph II, who required overtly political rhetoric to be removed. Mozart complied on paper and transferred the critique into the music. Servants Figaro and Susanna are given rhythmic agility, melodic intelligence, and emotional fluency. Count Almaviva, by contrast, sounds unstable and morally confused. Hierarchy survives in the libretto, but collapses in sound. This is Enlightenment critique expressed musically rather than verbally. In Don Giovanni, Mozart explores freedom without responsibility. Giovanni seduces, kills, mocks morality, and refuses repentance even when confronted by supernatural judgment. He is dragged to hell, yet the opera refuses to provide a clean moral resolution. Is Giovanni hero or monster? Is justice restored or merely imposed? Mozart leaves the question open. Vienna institutionalizes ambiguity. In Die Zauberflöte, or the Magic Flute, Enlightenment philosophy appears directly. Trials of fire and water symbolize moral education. Sarastro's brotherhood promotes reason, wisdom, and self-discipline. Superstition gives way to knowledge. Masonic symbolism frames humanity as improvable through learning. Crucially, the Magic Flute belongs to the German Singspiel tradition, combining spoken dialogue with music. This brings opera closer to ordinary audiences and marks Vienna's turn from purely aristocratic Italian models toward public moral education. Mozart's The Abduction from the Seraglio also belongs here, a German Singspiel shaped by Vienna's fascination with the Ottoman world, pairing Enlightenment mercy with exotic color and marking Vienna's turn toward opera for broader publics. This tradition later becomes institutionalized in the Vienna State Opera, where imperial heritage meets public culture. Mozart merges popular theatre with philosophy. Comedy and metaphysics share the same stage. His defining trait is radical humanity. Nobles, servants, fools, and villains all possess inner life. This Viennese trajectory culminates in Ludwig van Beethoven, who stands historically at the hinge between Enlightenment and Romanticism. Beethoven initially admired Napoleon Bonaparte as a revolutionary hero and dedicated his Symphony No. 3, Eroica, to him, until Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Beethoven tore up the dedication in disgust. This moment marks his disillusionment with political power and his turn toward individual moral heroism. In Fidelio, Leonore disguises herself as a man to rescue her husband from political imprisonment. The prisoner's chorus gives voice to men briefly allowed into daylight, expressing freedom as lived experience rather than abstraction. Liberty is no longer guaranteed by institutions. It must be seized through courage. Beethoven remains philosophically a man of the Enlightenment, believing in justice and human dignity. But emotionally, he's a romantic, placing faith in heroic individuality. Vienna does not produce opera as spectacle like Paris or as market competition like London. It produces opera as social reasoning, a medium for examining authority, class relations, moral responsibility, psychology, and political freedom. Fundamentally, Venice teaches opera how to survive commercially. Paris teaches opera how to represent the state. London teaches opera how to dramatize individual conscience. But Vienna teaches opera how to reason about society itself. Through Gluck's reform in Orfeo ed Euridice, Mozart's egalitarian psychology, even if carefully negotiated within Habsburg imperial censorship under Joseph II in The Marriage of Figaro, to his moral ambiguity in Don Giovanni, and his fiancée swapping in Così fan tutte, to the magic flute, where Enlightenment ideals are made explicit, to the abduction from the Seraglio and the clemency of Titus, where the Roman emperor answers political betrayal and attempted assassination with radical forgiveness, all fundamentally discuss society itself. Haydn moves beyond aristocratic patronage, and Beethoven translates Enlightenment ideals into romantic action in Fidelio. Vienna reimagines the art from ornamental opera seria into ethical drama. Italian excess yields to Germanic Singspiel vigor, together turning the stage into a philosophical instrument, a public forum for testing dignity, responsibility, and freedom. This is why Vienna matters. It is where opera becomes ethical. Chapter 6: Germany, Wagner, Myth, and the War of the Romantics. If Vienna teaches opera how to reason about society, Germany asks a more radical question. What is opera ultimately for? Early 19th century Germany is not yet a unified nation. It exists as a collection of kingdoms, grand duchies, principalities, and free cities linked by language, folklore, and romantic philosophy. German artists turn inward, searching for identity in Germanic medieval legend, myth, and nature. Opera becomes one of the primary vehicles for this cultural self-definition, and this is why German opera develops differently from Italy or France. It does not aim first at civic unity or state representation. It searches for spiritual and cultural coherence. The transition begins with Karl Maria von Weber. Weber's Der Freischütz introduces forests, hunters, supernatural terror, and rural legend into serious opera. Its plot centers on a marksman who bargains with dark forces for magical bullets, risking his soul to win love and success. Evil is no longer abstract or courtly, it lives in the landscape. And this is the birth of German romantic opera, where nature becomes psychological, folklore becomes drama, and fear becomes music. Opera turns inward. Then comes Richard Wagner. the operatic successor to Meyerbeer and Weber. Wagner does not refine opera, he attempts to replace it. He abolishes the traditional alternation of aria and recitative. He builds continuous musical flow, expands the orchestra into philosophical narrator, and organizes entire works through networks of leitmotifs. He calls this the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total artwork. Opera becomes worldview, and alongside works like The Master Singers of Nuremberg and The Flying Dutchman, his major works each stage a different aspect of romantic crisis. Tannhäuser pits spiritual devotion against erotic creativity. The hero oscillates between holiness, represented by Elizabeth, and desire, represented by Venus, unable to reconcile the two. Wagner dramatizes the romantic split between body and transcendence. In Lohengrin, the opera of the bridal chorus, a knight may save a kingdom, but only if no one asks his name or origin. When the question is finally asked, everything collapses. Wagner explores faith destroyed by rational inquiry. Tristan and Isolde abandons external plot for inner obsession. Two lovers seek fulfillment only in death. Harmony is stretched almost beyond recognition, and musical tension never truly resolves. This work redefines Western harmony. Opera folklore insists, if Tristan feels easy, something is wrong. It is meant to feel exhausting and unstable. Wagner's four-cycle opera, The Ring of the Nibelung, draws on Germanic myth to depict greed, domination, betrayal, and collapse. Gods like Odin and heroes like Siegfried are corrupted by the desire for power. The world ends not through accident, but through moral failure. This is the famous opera of the Ride of the Valkyries. This is Wagner's political philosophy in mythic form. In Parsifal, Wagner turns away from heroic conquest towards spiritual healing. Parsifal, the pure fool, succeeds not through strength but through empathy. The opera was originally restricted to Wagner's own theatre and treated almost as sacred ritual. Even today, performances often discourage applause. This opera of sacred spears, knights of the Holy Grail and sorcerers behaves like ceremony, not theatre. Wagner was personally involved in the failed 1849 Dresden uprising. He fled Germany under threat of arrest and spent years in Swiss exile. The Ring is conceived during this period. Its vision of collapsing gods and poisoned authority grows directly out of revolutionary disappointment. Power fails, system rots. Redemption becomes spiritual rather than political. This is Wagner's worldview, and this Bavarian romanticism also produces Ludwig's fantastical castles, notably Neuschwanstein, which visually mirror Wagner's mythic universe: swans, knights, mountains, transcendence. Bavaria provides Wagner not with just money, but atmosphere. Crucially, all of this coincides with German unification in 1871. Wagner lives to see Germany become a nation. Bayreuth emerges at exactly the moment Germans are seeking cultural symbols equal to political power. Wagner becomes more than a composer, he becomes a national mythmaker. Wagner's radical redefinition of music divides Europe. This becomes known as the War of the Romantics. Not a literal war, but a deep aesthetic and philosophical conflict over what music should become. At its core is a single question. Should music evolve toward Wagnerian totality, myth, philosophy, endless melody, or preserve classical balance and formal restraint? On Wagner's side stands Franz Liszt, who champions progress, transformation, and programmatic music. Liszt promotes Wagner's work and pushes music towards narrative and symbolic expression. Opposing Wagner is Johann Brahms, who defends structural discipline, absolute music, and continuity with classical forms. Brahms believes music should stand on its own, without mythic scaffolding. Between these two poles stand two bridge figures:
Felix Mendelssohn, representing classical balance and clarity, and Robert Schumann, embodying psychological intimacy and poetic subjectivity. Though neither is primarily operatic, both shape the intellectual climate in which opera is debated. Opera lies at the center of this conflict because Wagner has made it the arena in which all artistic meaning is contested. Germany teaches opera how to become myth, that is Wagner's legacy. And the War of the Romantics is the shockwave of that transformation. After Wagner, opera is never the same. Chapter 8: Verdi. If Germany turns opera into myth, Italy turns it into shared feeling. 19th century Italy is not yet a nation but a wounded mosaic. Duchies, kingdoms, and foreign crowns stitched awkwardly across the peninsula, with the north, Milan and Venice among them, pressed beneath Austrian boots and the cold administrative hand of General Radetzky. Political speech is strangled by censors. Organizing is an act of quiet heroism. Patriotism survives in whispers, tricolor cockades, and secret networks like the Carbonari. National identity exists more as fever dream than fact, carried in the prophetic writings of Mazzini, in the red-shirted legends of Garibaldi, and in the cool strategic calculations of Count Cavour, but also in the moral gravity of Alessandro Manzoni, whose prose gives literary meaning to a people still politically unborn. Around them orbit kings and republicans, martyrs and pragmatists. Carlo Alberto of Sardinia gambles and fails against Austria, laying constitutional groundwork. Daniele Manin defends a brief Venetian republic. Carlo Cataneo imagines a federal Italy from besieged Milan. And in time, Vittorio Emanuele II provides the crown that seals the project. Beneath the official map runs a second, invisible Italy, made of exile, coded letters, and midnight oaths. Prison and banishment are common fates, as in the case of Silvio Pellico. Diplomats bargain abroad, and young patriots rehearse revolution in cafes and garrets. In this climate of surveillance and longing, opera becomes one of the few public spaces where collective emotion can circulate safely, where grief, defiance, and hope may be sung aloud, and where even Giuseppe Verdi becomes a cipher for liberation. And before Milan hardens into political nerve center, there is Naples, volatile and musical, already trembling with insurgent energy. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Naples is Europe's operatic factory. It has multiple major theatres, powerful conservatories, and a vast audience for vocal music. This is where bel canto is refined. Long melodic lines, extreme breath control, and a vocal style that treats beauty itself as expressive meaning. Naples produces the singers and technique that dominates Europe. Without Naples there is no Rossini, no Bellini, no Donizetti, and ultimately no Verdi. Venice invents public opera. Naples industrializes it. The bridge from classical elegance to romantic intensity is Rossini. His masterpiece, The Barber of Seville, is more than comedy. It introduces a new kind of operatic hero. Figaro is not noble, he is indispensable. His entrance aria, Largo al factotum, presents intelligence, speed, and adaptability as survival skills. Authority is mocked, wit wins. Rossini teaches Italian opera something crucial. Cleverness can defeat hierarchy. This Enlightenment inheritance feeds directly into Romantic Italy. Next come the great bel canto tragedians. Bellini stretches melody into suspended emotional time. In Norma, the priestess sacrifices love and power in an atmosphere of long-breathed lyricism. Noble self-denial becomes musical beauty. Donizetti goes further inward. In Lucia di Lammermoor, madness itself becomes the dramatic climax. Lucia's breakdown is not decorative virtuosity, it is the emotional truth of the story. Bellini and Donizetti establish psychological collapse as operatic subject, suffering as aesthetic center, madness as revelation, They create the emotional vocabulary Verdi will later politicize. Now Italy's operatic gravity shifts north. Milan is under Austrian rule. Censorship is strict. Public assembly is risky. This makes Teatro alla Scala more than a theatre. It becomes a civic arena. Audiences use applause, silence, and encores as political signals. Opera houses function as surrogate parliaments. People do not attend merely to be entertained. They come to hear themselves. This becomes literal during the 5 days of Milan, when citizens drive Austrian troops out of the city. The same population singing in opera houses is building barricades in the streets. Italian opera is no longer metaphorically political. It is physically embedded in revolution. Into this charged atmosphere steps Giuseppe Verdi, whose career aligns almost exactly with the Italian Risorgimento. Verdi does not write political manifestos, but his operas become emotional vessels for a people living under foreign rule. This begins with Nabucco. With Giuseppe Verdi, Italian opera becomes political emotion. With Nabucco or Nebuchadnezzar, exile becomes metaphor. The chorus, Va pensiero, mourns a lost homeland. Italian audiences immediately understand. The Babylonians on stage stand in for the Austrians, the captive Hebrews for the Italians themselves. They are the exiles. The chorus becomes an unofficial national anthem long before Italy exists as a nation. Verdi's name itself turns into political shorthand. Viva Verdi! Viva Vittorio Emanuele, Re d'Italia! Opera becomes national memory. Don Carlos is partly set at Aranjuez. The Spanish prince loves Elizabeth, only to lose her when she is forced to marry his father, King Philip of Spain. Carlos and his friend Rodrigo attempt to free Flanders from imperial rule. Both fail. Private heartbreak collides with authoritarian power. Political, but abstract. Read allegorically rather than sung in the streets. After collective exile comes individual devastation. In Rigoletto, a bitter court jester serves a predatory duke until his own hidden daughter is seduced and murdered. The duke sings La donna è mobile while innocence dies. Verdi makes the audience hum the tyrant. Charm masks brutality. Il Trovatore unfolds amid civil war in Spain. Two brothers unknowingly separated at birth fight over the same woman, while a gypsy mother pursues revenge for her burned child. The plot spirals. Inherited trauma rules. In La Traviata, Violetta, a Parisian courtesan, gives up true love to preserve bourgeois respectability and dies abandoned of tuberculosis, even as the glittering piece, Brindisi, celebrates champagne and pleasure. Society sparkles, but the individual disappears. With Macbeth, ambition drives a couple into murder and madness. With Simone Boccanegra, a former pirate turned statesman loses his daughter, briefly regains her, then dies poisoned amid Genoese factional warfare. Power corrodes intimacy. Ida moves to ancient Egypt. Ida is an Ethiopian princess enslaved by her enemy, Radames. The Egyptian general who loves her is expected to marry the pharaoh's daughter. Torn between love, homeland, and military duty, both choose loyalty over life and are buried alive together. Italy now exists as a nation. Verdi warns that empire still dehumanizes. In Otello, political authority collapses into psychological terror. A victorious general is slowly manipulated into murdering his innocent wife. Finally, Falstaff closes Verdi's career with comedy. An aging knight attempts seduction, is repeatedly humiliated, and the entire cast concludes that all humanity is ridiculous. After decades of betrayal and death, Verdi ends with forgiveness. Standing apart yet fully canonical, the Messa de Requiem transforms liturgy into theatrical confrontation with mortality. Sacred music written with operatic force. Nabucco gives Italy a voice.
The middle operas expose how power destroys love. Ida asks what empire costs the soul, and Othello shows tyranny moving inward. Falstaff releases judgment. Verdi begins by speaking for a people, but ends by forgiving humanity. With Puccini, Italian opera abandons nationalist chorus and turns inward toward personal suffering. Puccini belongs to Verismo, ordinary people overwhelmed by emotion. La Bohème follows young Parisian artists struggling with poverty while falling in love. Mimi grows ill, money runs out, and joy collapses into loss. The opera shows how fragile beauty becomes when life presses in. Tosca places a singer between her lover Cavaradossi and a sadistic police chief. Political repression becomes intimate terror, and the story ends with betrayal, murder, and suicide. Madama Butterfly centers on Cho-Cho-San, a young Japanese woman abandoned by an American naval officer, Pinkerton. Colonial fantasy dissolves into waiting and heartbreak, ending in self-sacrifice. Gianni Schicchi presents a Florentine family tearing itself apart over an inheritance. Schicchi impersonates the dead man, rewrites the will, exposes greed through comedy, and secures happiness for the young lovers. Turandot confronts a frozen princess who executes failed suitors. Prince Calaf endures her riddles, and his aria, Nessun Dorma, transforms private suffering into public triumph as cruelty finally yields. Puccini moves from fragile youth to state violence to imperial abandonment, briefly releases judgment through comedy, and ends by converting pain into spectacle. Where Giuseppe Verdi speaks for a people, Puccini speaks for individuals. Italy does not turn opera into philosophy like Vienna. It does not turn it into myth like Wagner, and it does not turn it into state spectacle like France. Italy turns opera into collective emotion. Naples builds the voice. Rossini sharpens intelligence. Bellini and Donizetti deepen suffering. Milan politicizes the feeling, and Verdi nationalizes it. Puccini humanizes it. This is Italy's lasting contribution. Opera as emotional truth shared by a people. Chapter 8: France after Wagner, Realism, Fantasy, and the Birth of Modernism. If Germany turns opera into myth, France responds by pulling it back to human scale. By the late 19th century, Paris is Europe's artistic laboratory. Wagner's influence is everywhere: his harmonies, his orchestral weight, his philosophical ambition. But French composers increasingly resist the idea that opera must become metaphysical destiny. This resistance is not purely aesthetic. It unfolds inside three powerful historical pressures: France's humiliating defeat by Prussia in 1871, the rapid modernization of Paris into a dense urban metropolis, and the expansion of the French colonial empire. German victory makes Wagner feel like a symbol of cultural dominance. Paris is rebuilding itself through boulevards, cafes, galleries, and exhibitions. Empire shapes imagination even when unspoken. French artists grow suspicious of monumentality, myth, and grand philosophical systems. France does not try to out-Wagner Wagner. It dissolves him. Opera turns toward realism, irony and fantasy, atmosphere and suggestion. The decisive rupture comes with Georges Bizet and Carmen. This opera shocks Paris. Carmen is not redeemed. She is not elevated. She is not spiritually transformed either. She simply refuses ownership. The plot is brutally direct. Don José abandons duty for obsession. Carmen the gypsy insists on freedom, and he murders her when she will not submit. Bizet replaces myth with psychology. The famous habanera defines love as untamable force. The Toreador song celebrates spectacle and masculine bravado. There is no transcendence here, only consequence. Opera folklore still warns, sing Carmen too young, and she takes your voice. A way of saying that Bizet demands mature emotional control. With Carmen, French opera abandons heroic destiny and embraces realism. This is modernity entering opera. Where Bizet moves toward realism, Jacques Offenbach moves toward psychological fantasy. In Les Contes d'Hoffmann, the poet Hoffmann recounts 3 failed loves, each woman representing a different fragment of his psyche. The opera becomes a study in artistic obsession and divided identity. Its most famous moment, the barcarolle Belle Nuit aux Nuits d'Amour, floats serenely above stories of illusion, mechanical dolls, fatal illness, and betrayal. Offenbach shows that the romantic artist is already breaking apart. Opera becomes introspective. With Léo Delibes, French opera leans towards sensual surface, but not without consequence. His Orientalist opera Lakmé, a French rendition for the goddess Lakshmi, produces the famous Flower Duet, one of opera's most recognizable melodies. Yet beneath its beauty lies colonial fantasy. Lakmé is set in British India. Exoticism becomes atmosphere. Desire unfolds inside imperial imagination. This is a crucial theme in French opera, elegance intertwined with empire. Opera here reflects a society projecting itself outward while redefining itself inward. By the turn of the century, Wagner's influence has become overwhelming. French composers actively seek escape. The central figure is Claude Debussy. Debussy explicitly reacts against Wagnerian heaviness. He rejects endless melody, heroic myth, and philosophical orchestration. Instead, he pursues ambiguity, color, and suggestion. His opera Péléas et Mélisande replaces grand gesture with whispered intimacy of a medieval love triangle. Characters speak rather than declaim. Emotion drifts. Meaning is implied. Nothing resolves. This is musical impressionism. Debussy's famous piano piece, Clair de Lune, belongs to the same aesthetic world. Atmosphere over argument, light over monument. Where Wagner builds cathedrals, Debussy paints shadows. He is not simply composing differently. He is reclaiming French artistic independence. Bayreuth treats opera as sacred ritual. Paris treats it as experimental laboratory. French composers absorb Wagner, then fragment him. They replace myth with psychology, destiny with desire, monumentality with nuance. Opera becomes smaller, stranger, more interior. This mirrors Paris itself, a modern city suspicious of absolutes, fascinated by perception, fractured identity, and fleeting experience. France does not compete with Wagner's metaphysics. It dismantles them. Through Bizet, opera becomes realistic. Through Offenbach, identity fractures. Through Delibes, beauty reveals empire, and through Debussy, sound becomes atmosphere. Defeat by Germany, rapid urban modernization, and imperial expansion all shape this transformation. French opera becomes suggestion instead of proclamation. Richard Strauss, Romanticism collapses from the inside. After Wagner, German-speaking Europe does not move gently into modernity. It breaks. The figure who embodies this rupture is Richard Strauss. Strauss inherits Wagner's enormous orchestra, his chromatic intensity, and psychological ambition, but not Wagner's faith in myth or redemption. Where Wagner believed art could replace religion, Strauss exposes what remains when that belief collapses. His early operas push romanticism to the edge of brutality. In Salome, biblical desire becomes erotic expression. Salome demands the severed head of John the Baptist and kisses it in ecstasy. The orchestra explodes with violence and decadence. This is opera as scandal, shock replacing transcendence. In Electra, Strauss goes further. The music becomes almost feral. Electra lives entirely inside trauma and revenge. Harmony fractures. Psychological obsession replaces heroic narrative. Wagnerian intensity is pushed to breaking point. Strauss is writing at the dawn of psychoanalysis and just before World War I. His operas sound like a civilization becoming conscious of its own instability. Then comes a sudden reversal. With Der Rosenkavalier, Strauss turns away from brutality toward ironic nostalgia. Set in an imagined 18th century Vienna, filled with waltzes that never historically existed, the opera mediates on time, aging, and impermanence. Passion fades, youth passes. The Marscheline releases her love with grace. This is modern consciousness, aware of decay, skeptical of absolutes, tender toward loss. Strauss shows what happens after Wagnerian myth dissolves. First excess, then shock, then reflective melancholy. He does not rebuild meaning. He observes it slipping away. Chapter 9. Russia, Tchaikovsky, and the Return to Human Feeling. After Wagner turns opera into myth, Debussy dissolves it into atmosphere, and Strauss pushes it into psychological extremity. Russia offers something radically different. It returns opera to private emotion. 19th century Russia is an empire under strain. Power is centralized under the Tsar. Society is rigidly stratified. Western European culture is admired but never fully trusted. Russian artists struggle with a persistent question. How do you sound Russian without merely imitating Europe? This tension produces a distinctive artistic voice, inward, lyrical, restrained. The central operatic figure is Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Unlike Wagner, Tchaikovsky does not build mythic systems. Unlike Verdi, he does not mobilize crowds. And unlike Strauss, he does not seek shock. Tchaikovsky writes about missed chances, emotional hesitation, and social pressure. He is the great composer of regret. Tchaikovsky's operatic masterpiece is Eugene Onegin, based on Pushkin's novel in verse. Its plot is famously understated. Tatiana writes a passionate love letter to Onegin. He rejects her politely but coldly. Years later, their positions reverse. Tatiana is now married, Onegin is desperate, and she refuses him. No one is evil. No one triumphs. Everything is lost through timing. This is radical for opera. There are no gods, no tyrants, no villains driving catastrophe. The tragedy comes from social decorum and emotional restraint. People behave correctly and destroy their own happiness. Tchaikovsky replaces operatic destiny with psychological realism. Opera becomes interior. Tchaikovsky's particularity lies in melody. Where Wagner builds philosophical architectures, Tchaikovsky writes long, aching melodic lines that seem to breathe like human voices. His orchestration supports emotion rather than overwhelming it. His climaxes feel personal, not cosmic. This reflects Russian literary tradition, inwardness, moral sensitivity, and attention to everyday suffering. Even his non-operatic works belong to this emotional world. His ballet Swan Lake, though not opera, is culturally inseparable from his style. Doomed love, lyric melancholy, beauty overshadowed by fate. A cultivated listener recognizes this shared atmosphere. Unlike Italy or Germany, Russia does not turn opera into nationalist rally. Tchaikovsky's Russianness is not political, it is emotional. He does not mythologize the nation. He does not stage historical revolutions. Instead, he explores emotional repression, social obligation, private longing. This reflects a society where public dissent is dangerous and inner life becomes refuge. Russian opera becomes the sound of feeling contained. Historically, Tchaikovsky stands apart from Wagner and Strauss. He does not participate in the war of the Romantics. He does not seek philosophical systems. He does not aim for shock. He restores opera to human scale. After Wagner makes opera metaphysical and Strauss makes it psychological crisis, Tchaikovsky makes it intimate again. Russia does not make opera mythic like Germany. It does not make it nationalistic like Italy, and it does not make it impressionistic like France. Russia makes opera emotionally interior. Through Tchaikovsky, opera becomes about restraint rather than spectacle, memory rather than destiny, regret rather than conquest. This is Russia's contribution, opera as private conscience. The final chapter, what opera became and why it still matters. Opera does not grow in a straight line. It evolves by answering different historical needs. Florence invents it as intellectual experiment. Venice teaches it how to survive as public entertainment. Paris turns it into state ceremony. London makes it commercial and psychological. And Vienna turns it into Enlightenment ethics. Germany transforms it into myth. Italy gives it national emotion. France dissolves it into modern atmosphere. And Russia brings it back to private feeling. Each place does something essential. Opera absorbs all of it. By the early 20th century, opera contains myth and realism, philosophy and melody, crowds and solitude, empire and intimacy. It has learned how to be public spectacle, political language, moral inquiry, and psychological mirror. No other art form carries this much historical weight while still asking singers to risk their voices night after night. That is why opera feels excessive. It is. It has accumulated 4 centuries of cultural pressure. Opera survives because it allows contradictory truths to coexist. Beauty with cruelty, desire with consequence, power with vulnerability. It does not resolve history, it stages it. And this is why opera people sound superstitious. Over centuries, performers and audiences develop a shared folklore, not from irrationality, but from respect for how fragile this art form is. Voices fail, productions collapse, meanings shift across generations. So everyone learns the same quiet rules. Never whistle backstage. Never say good luck. Say toi toi toi. Every opera house has a ghost. And then there are the truths disguised as jokes. La Traviata punishes bad casting. Il Trovatore collapses under logic. Don Giovanni provokes arguments. Carmen waits or takes. La Boheme makes professionals cry. Tristan should feel dangerous. Parsifal behaves like ritual, and Hoffmann never agrees with itself. These sayings exist because opera is risky, vocally, emotionally, historically. Even the buildings know this. Most historic opera houses were designed in Baroque or Rococo style. Gilded balconies, horseshoe auditoriums, chandeliers, mirrors. Spaces engineered for intimacy, hierarchy, and spectacle. They were built so audiences could see each other as much as the stage, so audience itself became part of the performance. You are meant to be both observer and observed. When you enter an opera house today, you step into preserved social machine, aristocratic architecture repurposed for modern feeling. Opera doesn't just sound historical, it looks historical, and that tension never disappears. Opera persists because it asks people to risk themselves in real time. Singers with their bodies, audiences with their emotions, cultures with their memory. It is not just music, it is history made audible, and every performance is a reminder that civilization only survives if people keep singing it.